I was sitting at my own kitchen table when my son looked at me and said it was time for me to find my own place. Not because he was worried about me, not because I was struggling, but because I no longer fit into the life he was building. In that moment, I realized something far more painful than being asked to leave a house. I was being written out of my own story. I had spent decades giving, adjusting, staying quiet to keep the peace. And suddenly, I understood that loyalty, when taken for granted, becomes permission to erase someone completely. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we are truly grateful to have you here. If you have not already, do not forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with emotion, resilience, and unexpected turns. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 68 years old. I have lived most of my life inside one house in Savannah, Georgia, a white colonial with a deep front porch and narrow windows that catch the afternoon light. I moved into it as a young woman, newly married, carrying boxes that smelled like cardboard and hope. I stayed through decades that followed, through joy and exhaustion, through seasons that blurred together until the house itself felt less like a place and more like a witness. Every creak in the floorboards knew my footsteps. Every wall held a version of me I barely remembered. The house sat on a quiet street shaded by live oaks, their branches heavy with Spanish moss. In spring, pollen coated everything in yellow dust. In summer, the air pressed close and thick. I learned the rhythms of the neighborhood the way other people learn a language. Mornings belonged to birds and coffee. Evenings settled into cicadas and the slow turning of porch lights. Inside, the rooms were arranged the way they had been for years, not out of stubbornness, but familiarity. The kitchen cabinets were worn smooth, where my hands had opened them thousands of times. The staircase held a faint dip in the center from decades of climbing up and down, carrying laundry, groceries, children. I raised my son in that house. I nursed my husband there when his health began to fail. I hosted Thanksgiving dinners where the table stretched farther than it should have, leaves added, chairs borrowed, plates balanced carefully. Christmas mornings came with wrapping paper on the floor and the smell of cinnamon in the oven. Birthdays, graduations, ordinary Tuesdays that felt important only in hindsight, all of it happened there. The house did not belong to me in the way a deed suggests ownership. I belonged to it. For more than 30 years, I worked in the administrative offices of a local hospital. It was steady work, mostly invisible, the kind that keeps systems moving without ever being thanked. I learned to solve problems quietly, to anticipate needs before anyone asked. When I retired, people congratulated me on finally having time for myself. I nodded and smiled, but I did not know what that meant. I had spent a lifetime making sure other people were comfortable, safe, accounted for. It never occurred to me that this skill could one day be used against me. After my husband passed away, the house grew quieter, but it never felt empty. I filled my days with routines that anchored me. Sunday mornings at church, baking on Wednesdays, babysitting when my son needed help. I thought of these things as privileges, not obligations. I believed that being needed was the same as being valued. I did not question it, because questioning it would have required imagining a different version of myself, one who asked for space instead of offering it. My relationship with my son, Michael, had always felt simple to me. I saw him as the boy he had been, earnest and impatient, forever reaching for the next thing. Even as he grew older, married, built a life of his own, that image stayed fixed in my mind. I trusted him in the way mothers sometimes do, without analysis, without safeguards. It never crossed my mind that trust could have an expiration date. Looking back now, I can see that the life I was living at 68 was smaller than the one I had once imagined, but it was stable, predictable, safe. I told myself that this was what contentment looked like at my age. I did not know yet that stability can be mistaken for security, or that a life can appear settled right up until the moment it begins to shift. The house still stood, solid and familiar, but something in the air had started to change, even if I did not yet have the words for it. If you're still watching, and this moment felt uncomfortably familiar, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. What happens next is where the quiet discomfort begins to turn into something much deeper. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. Michael and Lauren moved in on a humid Monday in late May, the kind of day when Savannah air clings to your skin and refuses to let go. They said it would be temporary, just until they found their footing. I did not question it. Families, I believed, were meant to close ranks when someone needed help. I told myself the house was large enough. That company might even be good for me. After years of quiet routines, a little noise felt like life returning. At first, the changes were so small I nearly convinced myself they were imagined. Lauren rearranged the living room furniture to let in more light. She commented on how dark the wood looked, how heavy the curtains felt. I nodded and smiled, offering explanations that sounded like apologies. The furniture had been chosen years ago. The curtains had a purpose. But I also told myself that styles change, that younger people see things differently. I did not want to be the kind of woman who resisted change simply because it unsettled her. Over the next few weeks, the house began to shift around me. Decorative items disappeared from shelves and reappeared in boxes stacked neatly in the hallway. Lauren said she was just organizing, streamlining the space. I started hesitating before leaving personal items in shared rooms, as if I were borrowing space rather than owning it. I found myself carrying my coffee mug back to the kitchen immediately instead of setting it down, careful not to leave traces. Michael tried to reassure me without ever quite addressing what I felt. He spoke in the calm, reasonable tone he used at work, the one that made every suggestion sound logical. He mentioned that managing a large, older house could be stressful. He reminded me that paperwork and finances were complicated, especially now that I was older. When he brought out documents for me to sign, I barely skimmed them. I trusted him. I trusted that he knew what was best, that he would never ask me to do something that could harm me. I noticed my routines shrinking. I baked less because the kitchen always seemed occupied. I stopped inviting friends over because it felt awkward to explain the shifting dynamics. When I did sit on the porch in the evenings, I felt like I was lingering in a space that no longer belonged solely to me. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. I reminded myself that mothers adapt. We always have. Lauren rarely raised her voice or spoke harshly. Her disapproval came in quieter forms, in comments framed as observations rather than judgments. She spoke about efficiency, about modern living, about how much easier life could be with fewer things. I listened and absorbed more than I should have. I began to question my own preferences, my attachment to objects and habits that had once felt essential. The moment that lingered with me happened one afternoon while I was folding laundry in the den. Lauren passed through and paused, surveying the room with a thoughtful expression. She said almost casually that the space could be repurposed more effectively, that it might work better as an office or a nursery someday. She did not ask my opinion. She did not need to. The implications settled heavily in my chest. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. I realized that no one had asked whether I wanted things to change. Decisions were being made around me, not with me. I was still there, still useful, still accommodating, but something essential had shifted. The house that once held my whole life now felt like a place I was expected to pass through quietly, leaving as little imprint as possible. I did not yet know what was coming, only that the ground beneath me had begun to move. If you're still here and starting to sense where this is heading, comment number 2 below. The next chapter reveals the first crack that changes everything, and once it appears, it cannot be ignored. Let's continue with chapter 3. The morning Michael decided to talk to me began like any other. I woke just before 6, as I always did, and moved quietly through the house while the air was still cool. The kitchen smelled faintly of yesterday's coffee. Sunlight filtered through the window above the sink, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Nothing about that morning suggested it would become a dividing line in my life, a moment I would later measure everything against. Michael was already awake, sitting at the table with his phone face down in front of him. Lauren was not there, which struck me as unusual. I poured my coffee, took my usual seat, and waited for him to speak. He did not rush. He folded his hands the way he did when he wanted to appear thoughtful, considerate. That posture alone should have warned me. He began by talking about practical things: the size of the house, the upkeep, the stairs. He spoke calmly, as though listing facts rather than laying groundwork for a decision that had already been made. He mentioned how things change as people get older, how priorities shift. I listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, still unaware that this conversation was not an exchange, but a presentation. Then he said it. He told me he thought it might be time for me to find a place of my own, somewhere more suitable for this stage of my life. He framed it as concern, as care. He said it would be easier for me, safer. He said they needed space to build their future. The words landed softly, but their meaning was sharp. I realized he was not asking what I wanted. He was informing me of what would happen. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt. I felt oddly removed from my body, as though I were watching the scene from a distance. Part of me waited for the punchline, for him to say this was a misunderstanding. Another part of me understood immediately that this was the conclusion of months of quiet decisions made without me. I had been present for all of them and still completely absent. Michael mentioned a senior living community nearby, one he said had good reviews and plenty of activities. He spoke about convenience, about how I would not have to worry about maintenance anymore. He said it as if relieving me of responsibility was a kindness, not a theft. I thought of the garden I tended myself, the errands I ran, the routines I still enjoyed. None of that seemed to register in his calculations. What hurt most was not the suggestion itself, but the certainty behind it. He spoke as though my life had already narrowed to a set of limitations he could manage for me. Age had become a category, not a number, a justification. I was no longer his mother in that moment. I was a problem to be solved efficiently. When the conversation ended, it did so quietly. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits. Michael left the room to take a bowl. I sat there alone at the table, my coffee cooling untouched. The house felt suddenly unfamiliar, as if the walls had shifted slightly while I was not looking. The room held echoes of conversations past, laughter, arguments, reconciliations, and yet, for the first time, I felt like a visitor. I went about my day in a fog. I folded laundry, watered the plants, moved through rooms that now seemed provisional. Everything I touched felt temporary, as if it were already being cataloged for removal. I realized that the decision had not been made that morning. It had simply been delivered then. That night, I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. Each creak reminded me that I had built a life here, one that could not be reduced to square footage or convenience. I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that I had just been asked to step aside so others could move forward, and I knew that how I responded next would determine whether I disappeared quietly or chose something else entirely. If you're still watching and feeling that shift from confusion to realization, comment number 3 below to let me know. What comes next is the moment where patience is tested, and not everyone passes. Now let's move on to chapter 4. After Michael told me I should find a place of my own, I did not argue. I did not cry. I told myself that reacting too quickly would only make things worse. I had spent my life smoothing rough edges, calming situations before they escalated. This felt like another moment where patience might restore balance. So I stayed quiet and tried to make myself easier to live around, as if my presence had suddenly become something that needed to be managed. I began by shrinking my routines. I spent more time in my bedroom, leaving the common areas to Michael and Lauren. I folded laundry late at night instead of during the day. I stopped lingering over breakfast and carried my plate back to the sink as soon as I finished eating. Each small adjustment felt reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern of retreat. I was making myself smaller, hoping it would buy me time. The house no longer moved to my rhythms. I adjusted my schedule around theirs, waiting until the kitchen was empty before cooking, stepping aside when conversations turned into plans I was clearly not part of. When friends called and asked if they could stop by, I found myself hesitating. It felt simpler to say I was busy than to explain why the house no longer felt like mine to offer. Michael grew more distant without ever being unkind. He spoke to me politely, efficiently, as if our relationship had shifted into something more formal. Lauren, on the other hand, grew increasingly comfortable making decisions without consulting me. She rearranged storage spaces, talked openly about future changes, and discussed possibilities as if my departure were already settled. I watched it happen and said nothing, telling myself that speaking up would only confirm their belief that I was resistant, difficult. At night, I replayed the past in my head. I thought about all the times I had adjusted my own life to make space for others. I had put my career on hold when Michael was young, turned down opportunities because they were inconvenient for the family. I had never framed those choices as sacrifices. They were simply what needed to be done. Now, for the first time, I wondered whether being so accommodating had taught the wrong lesson. The doubt crept in quietly. Maybe I really was holding them back. Maybe this was what people meant when they talked about aging, about knowing when to step aside. The thought made my chest tighten, not because it felt true, but because I had started considering it at all. I had always believed that my worth was tied to what I provided. Without that role, I felt unmoored. The moment that changed everything came unexpectedly. I was passing by the study one evening when I heard Michael's voice, low and focused. He was on the phone, speaking in a tone I recognized from his work calls. He talked about timelines, about market conditions, about what could be done once certain obstacles were removed. I did not hear every word, but I heard enough to understand that my moving out was not an open question. It was a step in a plan that extended well beyond my comfort. I did not confront him. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap. Something inside me settled then, not into resignation, but into clarity. I saw, with a sharpness that surprised me, that no amount of accommodation would restore my place in this house. My silence had not protected me. It had only made my absence easier to imagine. That night, I stopped trying to be easy to live without. I did not yet know what I would do next, but I understood that continuing as I had been would lead to the same end, only quieter. The realization was painful, but it carried a strange steadiness with it. For the first time since that morning in the kitchen, I was no longer reacting. I was watching, thinking, and beginning to prepare. If you're still with me and wondering how long someone can shrink before they break, comment number 4 below. The next chapter uncovers a truth that changes the meaning of everything you've heard so far. Let's continue to chapter 5. I did not confront Michael after that night. Instead, I did something I had not done in years. I started looking closely at the details of my own life, not emotionally, but practically. I told myself I was simply organizing, catching up on paperwork I had neglected. That was the story I needed in order to begin. I pulled old folders from the filing cabinet in the hall, the one that had always held insurance statements, tax returns, retirement documents. I spread everything across the dining room table and worked slowly, the way I used to when Michael was a child, and I checked his homework line by line. I was not searching for proof of betrayal. I was searching for clarity. At first, nothing jumped out. Statements looked familiar enough. Account names were the same ones I remembered. But as I moved deeper, comparing dates and balances, a pattern began to form. Numbers did not line up the way they should have. Deposits appeared where I could not remember authorizing them. Withdrawals were recorded during periods when I knew I had not touched the accounts. I told myself there must be an explanation. I had signed paperwork. I had given Michael authority to help. Surely this was just confusion. I sat there for a long time, staring at a single page, feeling the temperature in the room drop. The signature at the bottom was my name, but it was not my hand. It was too clean, too controlled. I compared it to older documents, to forms I had signed decades earlier. The difference was unmistakable. A realization settled over me with a quiet finality. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. The discovery did not make me angry right away. It made me cold. I felt the way I imagine someone feels when they step onto thin ice and hear it crack beneath them. The danger was sudden and absolute. I thought about how easily trust can be weaponized, how quickly a lifetime of faith can be turned into access. I reviewed everything again, this time with intention. I noted dates, amounts, patterns. I recognized how carefully it had been done, how much planning it required. This was not a moment of desperation. It was a strategy. The thought hurt more than any financial loss could have. Money can be replaced. Trust cannot. As I sat there, I saw Michael differently, not as the boy who needed me to tie his shoes or pack his lunches, but as a man who had learned how to use proximity as leverage. I understood then that the conversation about me finding my own place had never been about safety or concern. It had been about control, about removing obstacles to a plan already in motion. I cleaned up the table before anyone came home, sliding the documents back into their folders. I returned everything to the cabinet exactly as I had found it. I did not want questions. I did not want explanations. What I wanted was time. Time to think without interference. Time to decide what mattered more to me now, peace or truth. That night, lying in bed, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something steadier. I understood that what had happened crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. This was no longer about family conflict or generational misunderstanding. It was about autonomy, about whether I would continue to be managed quietly or claim the right to manage myself. I did not yet know what I would do with what I had learned. I only knew that pretending ignorance was no longer an option. Once you see the truth clearly, you cannot unknow it. And once you realize that someone is willing to take from you in silence, you owe it to yourself to stop being silent too. Knowing the truth did not send me into panic. It did something quieter and far more dangerous. It made me still. I moved through the days with a calm that surprised even me, as if my body had decided to conserve energy for what was coming next. I slept, I ate, I smiled when required. Inside, I weighed my options with the seriousness of someone deciding whether to stay afloat or let the current take them. I asked myself questions I had never allowed before. What would happen if I said nothing and went along with the plan they had already built around me? I could move into a senior community, let the house be sold, accept the story that this was the natural order of things. I imagined a smaller apartment, meals prepared on a schedule, my life reduced to safe conveniences. I imagined Michael visiting on holidays, relieved that everything had been handled neatly. The picture felt tidy and wrong. Then I considered confrontation. I could sit Michael down, lay the papers on the table, demand explanations. I could insist on apologies and accountability. I could force him to see what he had done, but I knew what that path would bring. Anger, defensiveness, a fracture so loud it would echo through every remaining year of our relationship. I had spent a lifetime absorbing conflict to keep the peace. I understood its cost. The third option had not existed for me before, or so I believed. It required a kind of selfishness I had been taught to fear. It meant stepping out of the story they had written and choosing my own ending, not quietly disappearing and not burning everything down, but leaving on my terms with my dignity intact. The thought frightened me because it felt unfamiliar, not because it felt wrong. In the middle of this reckoning, I found the documents. They were tucked into an old box that held my husband's papers, things I had not looked at since he passed. I had avoided them out of grief, out of the belief that the past should be left undisturbed. This time, I opened the box with intention. Inside was a trust fund established years earlier, managed overseas, with my name listed as the sole beneficiary. The details were clear, deliberate. My husband had planned for my independence long before anyone else questioned it. I sat on the floor with those papers in my lap and felt a strange mixture of sorrow and gratitude. He had known something I did not. He had understood that being capable and being protected are not the same thing. In that moment, I saw a version of myself that had never been acknowledged in this house. A woman with options, a woman with resources, a woman who did not need to ask permission to exist comfortably. The decision came together quietly after that. I would not announce it. I would not argue. I would reclaim control methodically. I would consult professionals who understood the systems I had trusted too easily. I would secure what was mine and let the consequences unfold without spectacle. Selling the house would not be revenge. It would be closure. I began making lists, practical ones, accounts to separate, documents to copy, calls to place. I did not rush. Rushing belonged to fear, and I was no longer afraid in that way. What I felt instead was resolve, the kind that settles in your bones and does not leave room for doubt. For the first time since Michael told me to find my own place, I felt grounded. The choice I was making was not about punishment or escape. It was about alignment, about refusing to shrink further to preserve an illusion of harmony. I understood now that peace purchased at the cost of yourself is not peace at all. It is erasure. As I turned off the light that night, I knew the path ahead would be complicated. There would be fallout. There always is when silence ends. But I also knew something else with equal certainty. Whatever came next, it would be the result of my decision, not someone else's convenience. And that knowledge steadied me in a way nothing else had. If you're still watching and felt the weight of that decision, comment number 6 below. The choice has been made, and now the consequences begin to ripple outward in ways no one expected. Let's move forward to Chapter 7. Once I decided what I was going to do, I moved quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no confrontation that could be replayed and argued over later. I had learned that silence, when used deliberately, can be more effective than any speech. I began by reclaiming what should never have been taken from me, I met with professionals who spoke in precise language and asked careful questions. I signed documents that restored boundaries I should never have given away. The process was methodical, almost calming, because each step returned a small piece of control to my hands. The changes did not announce themselves right away. They revealed themselves through absence. Access that had once been assumed disappeared. Accounts no longer behaved the way Michael expected them to. Plans stalled without explanation. I watched the ripple spread without inserting myself into it. This was not cruelty. It was cause and effect. For years, decisions had been made without my consent. Now, decisions were being made without theirs. Michael noticed first. I could see it in the way his movements became sharper, more hurried. He made calls that ended quickly. He spent evenings pacing instead of sitting. He asked vague questions that never quite reached the point. I did not offer clarity. I did not owe it. What I owed myself was follow-through. Lauren reacted differently. Her patience wore thin. She spoke more openly about timelines and pressure, about how much depended on things moving forward as expected. I listened without responding. In her urgency, I saw something I had chosen not to see before. Concern had never been evenly distributed. What mattered most was not my well-being, but momentum. When momentum stopped, courtesy disappeared with it. The house felt different during that time. Tighter, louder, not because of raised voices, but because of unspoken tension. I moved through rooms with a calm I had not felt in years. I knew where I was going, even if they did not. That knowledge insulated me from the anxiety that seemed to infect everything else. Selling the house was the most difficult step, not because of doubt, but because of memory. I walked through each room one last time alone. I touched the door frames where height had been measured in pencil marks. I stood in the kitchen where so many meals had been prepared and shared. Letting go was not a rejection of the life I had lived there. It was an acknowledgement that the life had already moved on, even if the building still stood. When I met the buyers, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. They asked about the history of the house, about the garden, about the neighborhood. They listened. They did not see it as a transaction alone. They saw it as something to care for. That mattered more to me than any number on a page. The consequences reached Michael and Lauren quickly after that. What they had counted on unraveled. Certainty turned into urgency. Urgency turned into strain. I did not take pleasure in it. I took responsibility for my part and left the rest to them. This was not about winning. It was about ending a pattern that had relied on my compliance. By the time everything was finalized, the roles had shifted completely. I was no longer the person being managed. I was the one who had made a definitive choice and followed it through. The family structure they had assumed would always hold bent under its own weight. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. There is a difference. Triumph seeks witnesses. Steadiness does not. As I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I understood that consequences are not punishments handed down by anger. They are the natural result of actions taken and trust misplaced. And once they begin, they do not ask permission to unfold. I left Savannah early in the morning, before the heat settled in and before the neighborhood began to stir. There were no speeches, no carefully staged goodbyes. I locked the door for the last time and stood on the porch longer than necessary, letting the weight of the moment register without sentimentality. The house had held my life, but it no longer held my future. Knowing the difference made the leaving possible. The flight felt unreal, like a pause between identities. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the version of me that had spent decades anticipating other people's needs began to loosen its grip. When I arrived in Monaco, light poured across everything. The buildings rose clean and pale against the sea, and the air carried a salt sharpness that felt bracing rather than heavy. No one knew me there. No one connected me to a family role or an obligation. I was simply another woman arriving with luggage and intention. The first days were disorienting. I walked more slowly than everyone else, reading signs, listening to a language that moved too quickly for me to follow. I learned where to buy bread, how to navigate the streets, how to sit alone at a cafe without feeling conspicuous. I made mistakes and corrected them quietly. There was no one to rush me, no one to remind me of what I should already know. The freedom felt both generous and unsettling. Living alone in a place where I had no history forced me to confront myself without distraction. There were moments of loneliness that arrived without warning, usually in the evenings when the city softened and lights reflected off the water. In those moments, I reminded myself that loneliness was not the same as regret. I missed familiarity, not the version of myself that had been required to maintain it. What surprised me most was how little I needed to explain. No one asked why I had come or how long I planned to stay. No one questioned my age or my presence. I was not measured against expectations or quietly evaluated for usefulness. I could choose what to do with my days without accounting for anyone else's comfort. That absence of scrutiny became a kind of relief I had not known I was carrying. I began to notice myself returning. Not the woman I had been before motherhood or marriage, but someone shaped by those experiences without being defined by them. I took long walks along the water, letting my thoughts wander without direction. I read books I had once set aside because they felt indulgent. I sat with my own company and learned that it did not need improvement. Connections formed slowly without urgency. A familiar face at the market, a neighbor who nodded in recognition. These were not relationships built on obligation or history, but on shared space and mutual respect. I was not trying to recreate a life I had lost. I was allowing a different one to take shape. As weeks passed, the city stopped feeling foreign. I learned its rhythms, its quiet hours, its moments of brightness. I understood that starting over did not require erasing the past. It required placing it where it belonged. My history was part of me, but it no longer dictated my direction. By the time I realized it, I had stopped thinking of my move as an escape. It was a choice, deliberate and sustaining. I was not proving anything to anyone. I was learning how to live without explaining myself, without shrinking to fit expectations that were never mine to fulfill. The life ahead was still undefined, but for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. If you're still here and sensing that the end is approaching, comment number 8 below. What comes next is not about revenge or loss, but about what remains when everything else falls away. Let's move into the conclusion of this story. By the time Monaco began to feel ordinary, I knew I had stayed long enough to call it home. Not because the novelty had worn off, but because the days had settled into a rhythm that no longer required effort. I woke early, opened the windows to the sea air, and planned my mornings without considering anyone else's schedule. That simple freedom became the measure by which I judged everything. My life was not extravagant, but it was entirely mine. I managed my finances carefully and without anxiety, aware for the first time of what stability actually felt like. There was comfort in knowing that my well-being did not depend on my usefulness to anyone else. I was not waiting to be invited into my own life. I was already there. News from home reached me slowly, filtered through silence and time. Michael's plans did not unfold the way he had expected. The certainty that once carried him forward dissolved into a series of corrections and compromises. Without the safety net he had assumed would always be there, he was forced to make decisions with consequences that landed squarely on his own shoulders. His marriage strained under the weight of those consequences, revealing fractures that had been easy to ignore when everything seemed within reach. We spoke again eventually. There was no dramatic reunion, no clearing of the air that fixed everything at once. Our conversations were cautious, grounded in reality rather than obligation. I listened without rushing to reassure him. I answered questions without offering solutions. For the first time, our relationship existed without the expectation that I would absorb discomfort on his behalf. I thought often about the house in Savannah, about the years it had held together through the effort and compromise. I did not regret leaving it behind. Letting go did not erase the life I had lived there. It clarified it. I understood now that continuity does not come from clinging to structures that no longer serve you. It comes from the ability to adapt without losing yourself. Standing on my balcony in the evenings, watching the light shift across the water, I felt grounded in a way I had not in years. The choice I made had not been easy, but it had been clean. I had not escaped my life. I had stepped fully into it. This was the outcome I had not known how to imagine when everything first began to unravel. Not a dramatic victory or a perfect reconciliation, but something quieter and more enduring. A life that stood on its own, supported by intention rather than sacrifice. A life where I could look ahead without bracing myself. That, I realized, was the truest form of resolution I could have asked for. Some mornings in Monaco begin quietly, with lights spreading across the water before the city fully wakes. I stand by the window with a cup of coffee and let the stillness settle around me. It is in these moments that I think about the words that once cut so deeply. Find your own place. At the time, they felt like a dismissal, a way of pushing me aside when I was no longer convenient. Now, they sound different. They sound like an instruction I did not know I needed. For most of my life, place meant responsibility. It meant the role I filled, the space I occupied for others, the usefulness I provided. I thought belonging came from staying, from enduring, from being essential even when it cost me something. I did not realize how narrow that definition was until it collapsed. When it did, it forced me to ask a question I had avoided for decades. Who was I when no one needed me to be anything in particular? Finding my own place was not about geography, though geography helped. It was about authority, about deciding that my life did not require approval to be valid. I learned that age does not make a woman invisible. It simply reveals which relationships depend on her silence. I also learned that choosing yourself does not mean abandoning love. It means refusing to disappear for it. If there is anything I would offer to someone standing where I once stood, it is this. You do not have to wait until you are pushed to move. You do not have to make yourself smaller to keep peace that only flows in one direction. You are allowed to take up space, even later in life, especially later in life. I did find my own place, not because I was told to leave, but because I chose to arrive somewhere new within myself. That place is quiet, steady, and unapologetically mine. And once you stand there, truly stand there, you realize no one can ever take it from you. Life has a way of revealing its truth slowly, often through moments of discomfort that force us to look inward. What begins as loss can become clarity. What feels like rejection can quietly transform into direction. When familiar roles fall away, we are left with the essential question of who we are when we are no longer defined by service, sacrifice, or expectation. True belonging does not come from endurance alone, but from alignment with our own values. Choosing oneself is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of honesty. Growth does not end at a certain age, and reinvention is not reserved for the young. There is dignity in drawing boundaries, courage in starting again, and peace in claiming a life that reflects inner truth rather than obligation. Every ending carries within it the seed of a more authentic beginning, if we are willing to listen. Thank you for spending this time here. If this story resonated with you, Please share your thoughts in the comments and consider liking, subscribing, and following the channel for more stories like this.